Okay, the end of John chapter 3. In John chapter 3, verse 22, and these things Jesus and his disciples came to the land of where? Came into the land of Judea, and there he remained with them, and what? And baptized. So Jesus had a what? What could you say? He definitely had a following. And what else? Actually, when we get a little bit further into John chapter 4, what does it say about Jesus? He didn't actually do what? He didn't actually baptize, but his disciples were. And you can kind of, I think, very easily imagine how that you've got Jews and they understand the Old Testament ceremonial purification. Then comes John the Baptist, and what's John the Baptist talking about? Baptism for the remission of sins, for repentance. Then Jesus comes along, and he's baptized, and John and had all of this manifestation of the Spirit, God speaking from heaven. Now what do you think the people are wondering? Excuse me. Now what do you think the people are wondering? Who do we listen to? Who do we follow? I think that's exactly right. So in verse 23, John was also baptizing in Aenon near Salem because there was much water there. That has been traditionally known as the place just north of the Dead Sea. So as you would go to Jerusalem and go somewhat straight to the east, that's where Aenon, Salem is considered. Because there was much water there. They came and they were baptized. For John had what? Not yet been thrown in prison. Now why was he thrown in prison? Preaching to Herod about his marriage, yes. And we won't get to this as far as the content of the script for a while, but John is the only one of the Gospels that really tell us that his work has been going on before he gets into prison and after Jesus has started. So actually, his ministry, if you will, has lasted somewhere between 14 to 18 months. Jesus was how far basically behind him? About 6. So John and Jesus are preaching concurrently somewhere for 8 to 12 months. And it's really only John that you learn that from. There's all kinds of teaching that's coinciding with one another. The disciples are trying to kind of understand the difference between the two of them. John's going to go a long way in what he's about to say, but it's John's kind of work that gets cut short because he gets thrown into prison. So there was a dispute, of course, in verse 25, and what was it about? It was about purification, and of course, I tend to believe that the whole idea of purification was, it would appear that John the Baptist was changing the Old Testament laws. Was John the Baptist changing the Old Testament laws? No. What was John the Baptist doing? He was bringing in something completely new. But they weren't understanding that yet. So that seems to be what's going on. So they came to John and they said, Rabbi, he who was with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you have testified, behold, he's what? He's baptizing, and all are coming to him. So it's not a question of competing of two baptisms between the old law and John. Now it's kind of what? It's not two, it's what? It's kind of three. Now remember, this is to a Jew. Now they've got to figure out between three things. So they've got to figure out, what does the Old Testament say? But now there's John the Baptist. Oh, but now there's who? Now there's Jesus. So we got to figure out three things. What is John the Baptist about to tell them? It's not going to be three. It's really only going to be one. So he begins in saying in verse 27, John answered and said, a man can receive nothing unless it's what? Been given to him from heaven. Who's he speaking? Of whom is he speaking? He's speaking of Jesus. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is fulfilled. This goes back to an old Jewish notion. It's been pretty much done away now. But the friend of the bridegroom here, of course, obviously, who is the bridegroom? In this statement, it's going to be Jesus, but just in general, who was the bridegroom? It was the husband. So you have, and this is the actual background of it, you have a man and a woman who are united in marriage. They then go into the bridal suite, where they spend their wedding night. The friend of the bridegroom stays outside, and it was customary that as they hear the consummation of the marriage, then that is announced, and that is a moment of exultation. Obviously, that's not in our culture anymore, but that's the background of what John is talking about. So who is the bridegroom? Jesus is. Who is the friend? John. What is John doing with Jesus? He is announcing, he is exulting in Jesus coming and now taking his place in the teaching of the new covenant. Because remember, John, where do you put John in the timeline of God's revelation? Where does John actually belong? He belongs in the Old Covenant, but he belongs where in the Old Covenant? At the very end of it, yes. So kind of keep that in mind. In verse 29 again, he who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom, who is John, stands and hears him, rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is fulfilled. He must increase, and I must decrease. He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth is earthly and speaks of the earth. So the relationship between him and Jesus, I guess you kind of could say in our language, is just of no contest. John's saying, I am of the earth. I come from the earth. But Jesus is from above. So in verse 32, and what he has seen and heard, that he testifies. And no one receives his testimony. He who has received his testimony has certified that God is true. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God. For God does not give the Spirit by measure. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. He who believes in the Son has everlasting life, and he who does not believe the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. So John concludes this thought by saying that John the Baptist is going to decrease while Jesus increases. Jesus is here. For what reason? What's trying to occur here, these last few verses that John the Apostle writes? Jesus is here testifying of Himself so that people do what? So that people who believe in Him. That's what 33 says. He who has received His testimony has certified that God is true. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God, and God does not give the Spirit by measure. What does that mean? The Spirit by measure. In a limited way. So when you guys make a cake or you make a pie and you've got to measure out the sugar, you probably do it pretty carefully. I mean, it may not be down to the granular level, but you do a pretty good job measuring out what needs to go in it, too much or too little, and it kind of messes it up. God doesn't give the Spirit by measure. He gave the Spirit to Jesus in what way? I mean, essentially, John says it here. God does not give the Spirit by measure. So Jesus had the Spirit without what? Without measure. Yeah, exactly. To come and do the will of God, to come and do the work of God. And that was the point. So this is not only John the Baptist, but also John the Apostle's way of bringing John the Baptist's statement of work to a close in the New Testament. John keeps on going until he's arrested, but we don't hear anything of it. This is essentially kind of the last words speaking about the work of John the Baptist. Jesus is going to talk about him a little bit later on in Matthew chapter 11, of course, and then in Matthew chapter 14 we'll get the actual account of him being taken into prison. But here, this is John's words of saying John the Baptist is decreasing while Jesus is increasing. And the reason why is the whole purpose of God was not to exalt John the Baptist. The whole purpose of God was to exalt Jesus Christ. So He's taking those disciples, the people who didn't know about what they should be doing, who were confused and questioning about ceremonial purification, and He's pointing them to who? Yeah, He's pointing them to Jesus Christ. So we get to John chapter 4. So kind of setting that episode aside, moving on, John chapter 4. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus Himself didn't what? Did not baptize, but His disciples. There have been all kinds of, and if anyone has a thought on this, then please, you're welcome to share it. Why Jesus never baptized, we're never told. Now, we can come up with ideas as to why He didn't baptize, but instead His disciples baptized. I didn't mention it in the lesson because we started so late, but tonight we're going to talk about the Great Commission, where Jesus, who, according to John, didn't baptize anyone, but pretty much His last words on this earth, were telling His disciples to do what? Go out and baptize people. Now, why He never did, we're never explicitly told. But we are just simply left with Jesus Himself didn't baptize, but His disciples. So He left Judea and departed again to Galilee. But He needed to what? He needed to go through Samaria. This was interesting, the way that the Judeans treated Samaria. From what I understand, the Galileans didn't look at it this way. So if the Galileans needed to come south to Jerusalem for a feast, they would just come south through Samaria. But people who lived in Judea would not just go north to get to Galilee. The animosity there was so strong, and geographically I can understand it. What would they do in going to Galilee? They'd cross over the river, they would go north, and then cross back over the Jordan River again. So a journey that would normally take you 3 days, they would spend 5 or 6 days, or possibly even longer, going up to Galilee. Well, now Jesus was going up to Galilee, but He wasn't going to do it the way that the people in Judea normally did. He's just going to go straight through there. So He came to a city of Samaria, which is called what? Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And I had a picture. Maybe I can show it to you next week if we can get this thing going. But I had a picture of Joseph's tomb. So in Sychar, which is close to Samaria in current day in current day Israel, you can go and see Joseph's tomb. Now, it's not the easiest thing in the world to get into, and why is that? Joseph's tomb's actually where? Does anyone know? It's not in Israel, it's in the West Bank. So that makes it, of course, a little more inaccessible. It's not completely inaccessible, but it is more inaccessible. But you can go and tour Joseph's tomb. So that's there, it's still there. So Jacob's well was there. Again, it's still there, or this place that commemorates where Jacob's well was. Jesus, therefore, being what? Wearied from His journey. Now, John the Apostle is trying to show Jesus is who? Jesus is the Son of God. But John also adds a lot of notes that explains Jesus being human. So here He was, wearied from His journey, and thus He sat by the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman of Samaria came to draw water, of course, and what did Jesus say to her? Okay, give me a drink. For His disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. And the woman at Samaria, of the well at Samaria, what was her issue? Okay, so, first of all, you being a Jew, ask a drink from me. Number one, a what? A Samaritan. Number two, a woman. What was the deal with the Samaritans? Why was this an issue? What made the Samaritans hated by the Jews? The northern kingdom, 722 BC, taken into Assyrian captivity. And when they took them into Assyrian captivity, we often, I think, maybe slightly overstate the case that the land is just completely cleared of people. But it wasn't completely cleared of people. There were some Israelites left. But when they took away all of the people, then they had to bring people in. Because if you've got land and it's good land, it's productive land, what have you got to keep doing with it? You've got to keep working it. So they would bring in people from all different other nations, and 2 Kings 17 talks about this. Those people began to intermarry the Israelites, and they became the Samaritans. So how did a real, true, proper Jew see them? Because 150 years later, the Jews went into captivity, and then 70 years after that, they came back. And so by the time all of that had expired, you've got generations now of these people who are the Samaritans that are living there. How did they view them? As being what? almost kind of like heathen. I mean, it's a terrible term, but they basically saw them as half-breed people. But that is the way they saw them. That is the amount of animosity that they had. And then when they came back from captivity, and that's in the middle to the early 500s, because time is moving backwards in BC. So in the middle to the early 500s, after that, for 500 more years, there's all kinds of animosity that goes back and forth between the Jews and the Samaritans. And it really, really brewed this really bad blood between the two of them. So Jesus taking this step was pretty revolutionary. But what's He teaching everyone, including His disciples? In a pretty short period of time, you're going to be going to everyone and trying to teach them the gospel. So she is amazed. I mean, it's just remarkable. And even John has to add the little historical note, the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. So Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked Him, and He would have given you what? Living water. So when you start kind of thinking about what Jesus is doing, what is His first step here with this woman? Because when you think about it, what could He have done? He could have asked her what? Could have been, give me a drink. She gives him a drink, and he what? He walks away. He says, thank you, or whatever you would say in the equivalent first century. He just says, thank you, and that's it. But what does he say? In short, and this is really, really good instruction for all of us, and this is what I wanted to talk about, and it just so happened, I didn't plan it, but it just so happens to coincide with talking about the Great Commission tonight. He said something that she just couldn't what? She just couldn't what? She just couldn't what? He said something she just couldn't ignore. Yes, and what all of you guys said was all correct. But he said something she just couldn't ignore. So when we are talking to people and they're telling us about, usually the moment in which you get the chance to bring up conversations like this is when people are going through what kind of difficult time? Something bad. Maybe it's something in their family, or it's in their marriage, or maybe it's their job. So there's a million different ways, but we'll boil it down to the essence of two different ways. When they mention something to you, you can just say, I'm really sorry to hear that. And then it just disappears and you just walk away. Or you can say something that they just can't let go of. Now, what might be an example of that? Because this is where it really, really gets important. We can talk about theory all morning long, but what does it really boil down? What's the essence of it all? Someone tells you, my husband just got diagnosed with cancer. What is your response that they can't walk away from? Okay, maybe not. Is it good to tell people that you'll pray for them? Absolutely it is. What's even better? And Cecil just said it. What's even better? Take them into another room and pray for them. Or say something like, We're studying about this in our Sunday morning Bible class right now. And I'd love to tell you, take a few minutes and talk to you about what the Bible said about dealing with major things like this. If it's on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday, you could say, "Oh, I think my preacher's going to talk about stuff like this, I think next Sunday." And then you get on the phone and you call me and you tell me, "Hey, I got somebody who may come if you'll talk about suffering next Sunday." We'll put something together. We'll do something. May not be the best, but it will be something. So you're creating chances, you're creating opportunities that people just simply can't walk away from. It may not be something that ends up producing fruit, but that's not really the point. You want to create a circumstance like this woman that they just can't walk away from without doing what? Engaging in more talking. The more talking opportunities you get, the more the likelihood that you're going to have of actually talking to someone about Jesus Christ. It just goes back to the old adage, I've got a situation in front of me. Do I do something or do I do nothing? Well, if I do nothing, what am I guaranteed? Nothing's probably going to happen. So do I say something to someone or do I not? Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I don't. But most of the time I have to, because I know that if I don't, then everything's going to remain exactly the way that it is. When you talk about interacting with people, the very first thing that Jesus did, she didn't know Him from anyone. The very first thing He had to do is create an interest in her. He had to get her to start to talking. And so that's what He does here with the whole idea of living water. Because, of course, what was living water? It was spiritual. It was spiritual. What was it physically? Because, she didn't grasp that yet. What was living water physically? What was living water physically? Right. So when we lived back in Tennessee, and I still drive by it every time I go by, about 2 miles from my house, when you're driving along this windy road, there's cliffs, and that's pretty common for Tennessee. But in one, there's this indentation, and it runs up into a tiny, tiny little opening like a little cave. And water's coming out of it. And someone decades ago stuck a pipe up in there. And that pipe feeds out spring water. That spring water is the best, if you could just not concentrate on the hepatitis. That spring water is the finest tasting water that you could have. It is super, it's 50-something degrees because it's coming right out of the earth. So it's just wonderful, that living spring water. She was going to draw from what? Jacob's well, which could be stagnant, or it could have at least some kind of something coming into it. So that's what catches her attention, that living water. And to the Jews, that was just running water. And the woman said, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get living water? You don't get it out of a well. So are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock?" Someone going back 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, created this well. We've all drank from it, and now here you are saying what? I'm going to make it better. But that's, of course, not what He had in mind. Jesus answered and said, "Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become" what? A fountain or a well of water springing up into everlasting life. So what we're going to do, we're going to stop here. He catches her attention. Now he's really, really got her interested. Because now what's he starting to talk about? Now he's starting to talk about this eternal living water. She doesn't know about eternal living. I mean, the Jews had a notion of it. We could go back in the Old Testament and I could show you. But it wasn't really a strong formative idea. Now that's really getting her interest. And so we'll keep on going here in John 4 next week.